marking the end of the Mexican-American War and leaving close to 75,000 Mexicans in a compromising position. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848 inspired what would become an extensive battle against prejudice and discrimination. The agreement promised American citizenship, equal social status, and protection of property rights. The reality, however, was much different. Anglo-xenophobic views towards Mexicans helped create a stereotypical dogma that would marginalize even Americans of Mexican descent for decades to come. This created a profound wound within the Mexican psyche and changed the course of the lives of future generations completely. Major events, such as the repatriation of more than 1.2 million Mexicans, 40% of them mistakenly being American citizens, during the Great Depression, highlighted the conditions Mexicans, or those of Mexican descent, dealt with in their own country. Furthermore, amongst all of the categories that showcased unfair treatment of Mexican Americans, none was more evident than the struggle for equal education. Education has been an equalizing factor in American society for decades. Regardless of the efforts aspired, the vision failed to grant its endeavored impartiality and opportunity to a diverse group of minorities, one of the largest being Americans of Mexican descent. Initially, Mexican schools were built in rural areas, in an attempt to keep cheap labor in farms and keep Mexican children separated from the Anglo children. However, this practice gradually spread to urban areas and gained popularity. Its extent was so massive that by the 1930s, 85% of school districts in the Southwest were in some way segregated. In contrast to African Americans, who were separated on racial grounds, Mexican Americans were separated based on language and culture.
In places like California and Texas, where there was large populations of Mexican American students, they often had their own schools. Like there was the Mexican school and then there was the white Anglo school.
Students also underwent Americanization programs that attempted deculturalization by rewarding them for speaking English and punishing them for speaking Spanish. One of the most devastating parts of the issue is by far the conditions students experienced in schools. School conditions were horrendous. They were overcrowded and decaying. Teachers were encouraged to incinerate any child's dream of a future beyond labor in the homes and fields. Equipment was outdated, and funds for classroom supplies were constantly reduced, something unimaginable for Anglo children. Pupils were not given the tools necessary to meet college requirements, and more than half of Mexican American students dropped out of high school and were behind compared to the white children their age.
They also would use IQ tests to say that, Mexican students weren't as intellectually advanced as the Anglo students. That's why we need to keep them separated.
This would make the struggle for equality for Mexican Americans in the classroom a centerpiece of what will be the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement, or El Movimiento. After what was a lifetime for some people, the fight for equal education for Mexican Americans began in the 1930s in Texas and California. Though the Mexican American struggle for civil rights is lesser known than its African American brethren, several factors are the same, such as the act of segregation in schools. Furthermore, although Mexican Americans were considered white, segregation was believed to be justified in an effort to assimilate them into American culture, as well as because of their English language deficiency. Nonetheless, legal court cases, the creation of organizations, and walkout protests demonstrated the desire of Mexican Americans to challenge their reality and seek equality amongst their American peers. The Mendez versus Westminster School District of Orange County 1946 case became the first successful federal court case against school segregation in favor of Mexican Americans. In its verdict, the state of California stated that the segregation of Mexican Americans occurred mostly because of language barriers and not because of race. Though California law did allow segregation of Black, Indian, Japanese, and Mongolian children based on race, it did not mention anything regarding children of Mexican descent. Federal Judge Paul McCormick ruled that Mexican Americans were racially white and should be admitted to white schools as well. He stated that the Equal Protection Act of the 14th Amendment provided protection of student schooling. Even though Mendez versus Westminster declared the act of segregating Mexican Americans unlawful, the practice of it in local school districts remained. Mexican Americans still suffered de facto segregation supported by society and not by law. This case inspired other cases that brought attention to the act of segregating Mexican Americans, such as the Delgado versus Bastrop Independent School District, 1948 in Texas. This lawsuit was supported by the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, an organization that fought for desegregation in schools. However, even with a similar verdict as the Mendez versus Westminster case, schools in Texas found ways around complying with Texas law and continued their segregation based on language deficiency rather than race.
Years later, we have Brown versus Board of Education, which goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and a lot of those arguments that end up being used to win that battle first came from the precedent set in Mendez versus Westminster.
Although Brown versus Board of Education's decision declared segregation unconstitutional, the response of local authorities to stop all forms of segregation waned. Seeing no improvements in their struggle for equal education, students formed community organizations and used their constitutional rights to protest for change. Some of these organizations include the United Mexican American Students, UMAS, which advocated for equal treatment under the belief that Mexican Americans, or Chicanos, should proudly show the history of Mexican community. Along with the Brown Berets, a Chicano activist group that played a part in the greater Chicano movement for other Mexican American causes, including education, UMAS participated in some of the most important protests of the Chicano educational movement, including the East LA walkouts in March 1968. More than 15,000 students from 5 East LA high schools walked out of school to protest unfair treatment by racist and unsupportive teachers, exaggerated punishments, and cultural discrimination by school district. The walkouts lasted about 2 weeks, but even after meeting with the school board to come to an agreement, problems kept coming, as 13 students and community leaders were charged with conspiracy to commit misdemeanors. With time, all of the community efforts started by the Legal Court for Equal Education became institutionalized. Events such as these walkouts initiated the momentum that would allow Mexican Americans to force change. The struggle for equality has been elusive and considerably prolonged. However, the movement has started bringing major improvements for the education of Mexican Americans and other Latinos. Starting with the significant decision of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, a series of legislative measures opened a door for advancement in the struggle for equal education. In January of 1968, the Bilingual Education Act was created.
This Bilingual Education Act essentially used or provided federal funds to train teachers and to provide resources for these students who were English second language to get them on an advanced English language level where they could be integrated in the school.
Its main purpose remained to encourage bilingual instruction and raise cultural awareness. Ultimately, this would result in the decriminalization of speaking other languages as well. Other changes brought about by these legislative decisions led to the increase in the amount of Mexican American teachers and administrators in American schools, and a significant decrease in the amount of Mexican American students dropping out of school. Back in the 1980s, very few professors of Latin descent occupied these charges, whereas now, they make up more than 18% of teachers in the state of California. Additionally, multiple textbooks depicting Mexican American contributions were developed and are currently available for teachers to integrate this heritage into their social studies curriculum. One of the ways in which the United States is supporting the Latino community is through the emergence of organizations like American GI Forum, Hispanic Heritage Foundation, NHI, Hispanic Scholarship Fund, among others. Moreover, Mexican Americans have also experienced improvements regarding school enrollment. From 1990 to 2013, the Hispanic status dropout rate among 16 to 24-year-olds decreased by more than half, going from 32 to 12%. Notwithstanding, we must also recognize that despite the advancements, there are still some gaps that isolate the Latino population from other groups in education altogether. For example, statistics from 2017 show that Latinos had the second highest dropout rates, which only serves as a reassurance that there are still matters to be worked on. Therefore, we must keep striving to equalize our education system.